At the start of 2020, I set a goal for myself to read 26 books and 10,000 pages by the end of the year. That comes out to about one book every 2 weeks and about 30 pages a day. Here on New Year's, I can say finally that I have successfully completed my goal. So as celebration, here are all the books I read this year, ranked and briefly reviewed. Now I can say that happily. I don't think I read a truly bad book this year. Just some that were a little bit fine, a little bit middle of the road, you know. Also, no spoilers for any book, I promise. Drum roll please. The worst books I read this year were Worst Things and Queen Narelle by Sally Murphy. Sally Murphy is a local author from WA, and I met her and got them signed, but these books are just really not my thing. They're a long-form narrative poetry aimed at children much younger than me, which is why I didn't enjoy them. Although I did think they were cute, this one especially, and I like the illustrations. Next up is The Glim by by this book by Emily Rodda, which had been sitting on my shelves for a little bit, and I finally picked it up. And yeah, it was a pretty simplistic fantasy adventure with this weird CGI artwork collage thing. I don't even know. That was the most fascinating part about the book. A book in a similar vein, but from a more unexpected author, Stephen King. The worst book of his that I read this year was The Eyes of the Dragon, which is a fantasy novel aimed at younger children, rather than his usual very adult themes and style. Very simplistic fantasy. I did enjoy it more than The Glim. Great introduction to Stephen King if you're under the age of like 13. The Lost Symbol by Dan Brown. Very simply, too long, pretty unremarkable. Some cool scenes and some cool settings. Nothing that I remember very well or think about at all. Just read Angels and Demons instead. Revival, also by Stephen King, is a fine middle-of-the-road novel from him. I like the shorter length, as he is well known for his very thick tomes, and we'll get to some of them later. And I really like the rock and roll elements in this, especially. Some people say online that the ending is very, like, the scariest thing King's ever written, and it was a little bit freaky, but, like, not the scariest thing he's ever written. Read Gerald's Game instead. Okay, I'd say that from now on, the books go from being fine to being pretty good, and that tier starts off with The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, one of 2 Holocaust books I read this year by John Boyne. This one is, you know, if it had a cool premise, you know, it's the main character is the son of one of the Nazi leaders at Auschwitz, but aside from the premise, it was just very boring, very slow. I had to read this for school, but of course, the ending is very unexpected, very terrific. I read a lot of books with great endings this year, and that's what people remember about this book. So if you want a great ending, you should probably read this one. Restaurant at the End of the Universe. The Restaurant at the End of the Universe is the second book in the trilogy of 4, as it's known, and I feel like nothing really happened during the book, and that was its main issue. I did like the concept of the restaurant at the end of the universe and the host guy, but that was about it. A lot less funny than the first one as well. So I have a lot of Dan Brown books. Deception Point was the better of the 2 of his books this year that I read. Very fast paced, takes place over 24 hours, very thrilling, but I do prefer Dan Brown's religious mysteries like The Da Vinci Code and Angels and Demons over his like science fiction political mysteries, which is what this is. So it loses some points there. Some pretty cool scenes, some nice attempts at romance. A Single Stone by Meg McKinley is the next one on our list. It has a very cool premise. Very dystopian, very Hunger Games, but I just found it a little disappointing. It's a lot more ambitious than Deception Point, which is why it's above it on the list. If you really liked The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, the new Hunger Games movie, you should probably read this one. From now on, I call the books good. Like, on the other side of pretty good. Like, on the other side of good than pretty good, if you get what I'm saying. And we start off with Backwards by Rob Grant, one of the 2 authors of the original Red Dwarf duology. Red Dwarf being, like, a couple of years ago, my favourite book ever. This one is the 3rd book out of 4, and it only featured 1 writer, and you can definitely tell. It's a lot less funny, although the science fiction concepts are very interesting and stay at the same level as the first 2 books. The 4th and final Red Dwarf book, pretty interchangeable with Backwards on my list. Sort of goes back and forth depending on my mood, but Last Human has a cooler cover. This is written by the 2nd of the 2 authors, and this one's a lot wittier, but the fantasy and sci-fi elements were less cooler. So you can sort of see why the first 2 books, which was written by both authors, was, you know, better. This is possibly A unpopular opinion, but Stephen King's Salem's Lot I found just pretty boring. I don't like vampire media in books in general, I just find it a bit cringy. This book sort of seemed to be in a slump the entire time. I don't really remember that much from it at all, but I do know that the characters and the writing style were, as always with Stephen King, very, very good. I feel like I'm gonna get in trouble for not putting The Shining as my number one, but the same thing as Salem's Lot, I just found it very slow and took a long time to pick up, and I know that's the whole deal with the book, that it's mostly suspense and a little bit action, but I guess that's just not my style. I really did like Jack Torrance's descent into madness though, as well as Halloran's efforts to get back to the hotel. Next on our list is the de facto science fiction comedy, some would say The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams, the first book in the trilogy of 4. What more can I say? It's iconic for a reason. My favourite element was definitely all the Radiohead references. This next entry feels a bit sacrilegious to put above The Shining, and I know that the bottom of the list was mostly, childish books that were just too young for me to enjoy. But something about this book and their characters and the writing style is just so charming and enjoyable. For anyone who's never heard of it besides the movie, it's totally different. It's 12 books in the series. I already read them when I was like 12, but I figured I'd pick it up again because I just felt like a comfort read. The Outsider by Albert Camus. Thank God someone saw me reading this book and said, "Oh, you're reading Camus," because otherwise I'd be standing here like a stupid person saying, "Ooh, I read The Outsider by Albert Camus." I read 3 classics this year, and they all fall relatively into the same spot, and they're all 119 pages long, which is a bit weird. This one was super interesting, with some totally shocking moments and a very unexpected ending. And for a classic, it was really quite simple to read. Okie dokie, we're entering the top 10. Okie dokie, top 10 time. Why did I do it too? Animal Farm, George Orwell, The Outsider, and this book, pretty interchangeable, as they're both extremely topical classics. Luckily very short, 119 pages long, as I said. But this one just has the added element of having humour and irony in it, which is why it's above The Outsider. 7.9 out of 10. Holy shit, the ending to this blew me away and had me in tears. This is like I think the only book that made me cry this year. The one from my list that I recommend you all read. It's only 119 pages long. It took me 2 hours to read. What an amazing achievement. 7.95 out of 10. Number 8 on my list, The Song of Achilles, Madeline Miller. If you loved Percy Jackson as a kid and you haven't read this book, you're missing out. It's a love story between Achilles and his lover. You know Achilles with the heel, that guy. About halfway through, the book goes from like a very enjoyable romance to like a heartbreaking, interesting war drama. It's filled with images and scenes that I'll remember for a long time, as well as characters that are geniusly written, flawed, and complex. 8 out of 10. When you aren't expecting a book to be so good, it makes it even better, and that's what happened with Karen M. McManus's One of Us is Lying. Right, different outfit, yes. Anyways, this is a teen mystery romance, and it's such fun, so gripping, and very juicy. 8.2 out of 10. The second book in the Dark Tower, drawing of the 3, this fantasy thriller takes place on one beach with like 4 or 5 characters, and kept me hooked the whole time. When I was reading this, I couldn't wait to pick it up again to see what would happen. 8.2 out of 10. Woohoo, top 5, baby! I wanted to finish Stephen King's The Dark Tower series this year, but I only got up to The Wastelands, the 3rd book out of 7. Despite that, I still absolutely adored this book. It's got the best found family trope that I've ever read, and filled with high concept, high fantasy, freaky dystopian shit that I can't get enough of. The writing style's a bit wordy, and that's why they take longer to read, and I didn't finish them all, but it suits the dystopianness of it all. 8.5 out of 10. I said it earlier to read Mice and Men. I take that back. Read this book instead. The Happiest Man on Earth by Eddie Jacku is an autobiography. Actually the only non-fiction book I finished this year. He was in the Holocaust. He went to many Nazi internment camps, and yet in his 90s he wrote this book about being the happiest man on earth. And it's just, obviously you just hear that premise and you know it's going to be such an uplifting, but at the same time heartbreaking book, and that's exactly what it was. So uplifting and a real reminder of the power of humanity in every sense of the word. 9 out of 10. Okay, top 3. This book took me 2 weeks to read, and it was more than 10% of my whole page goal. Of course, Stand by Stephen King. I promised there'd be some chunky boys, and this is a true classic that definitely deserves its reputation. from go to woe. Woohoo, top 5, baby! I had such a great reading experience with this one. And for such a big book, it kept me hooked pretty much at every page. And for such a big book, that's all I want to say about it. If you feel adventurous, and by adventurous I mean feel like sitting down and looking at ink on paper for a really long time, then you should read this book. 9.3 out of 10. At the number 2 position, we have Susanna Clarke's Pure and Easy. This book is like a jigsaw puzzle that demands rereads, and it simultaneously has you understanding and questioning everything with every line. It starts out weird, it stays weird, but you get used to it being weird, and you sort of just start to accept and wonder what the hell is happening. The quotes from reviews on the cover, on the gorgeous cover, perfectly sum up the book, in my opinion. This is like a work of art, this book, you know? Like, frame this shit in the Louvre. I forgot to give this one a score, it gets 9.5 out of 10. We've gone through 26 books, and this is number 1. As soon as I finished this book, I really knew that there was no competition in what was my number 1, and it is Stephen King's 11/22/63. Every aspect is perfect. The plot, characters, premise, romance, the ending. Even though it's about going back in time to stop the JFK assassination, it's actually more than that. It's like a romance story. That, in my opinion, is my favourite part of it. And as with One of Us is Lying, it was totally unexpected. This novel hit home so hard for me, and I can confidently say that it is one of, if not my favourite Stephen King book, and definitely a favourite that I read this year. 9.9 out of 10. So there we have it. Another year done and dusted. I kept track of all the books that I read and the page numbers and the page counts and such. With this list, very simple. What should be my goal for next year? What are your favourites from my list? And from your list, what book should I read next year based on my favourites? Leave your thoughts in the comments.